Welcome back to the LCI Green Room. I am Jacob Winograd, host of the Biblical Anarchy podcast, part of our Christians for Liberty network. Glad to be with you tonight. Before we bring on tonight's guest, just a couple of housekeeping items and updates to take care of. Again, as I have been plugging for a while now, Faith Seeking Freedom version 2, so the second edition of our flagship book here is going to be out very soon. And our site where all the updates and sort of sneak previews are for it is live, and that you can go to faithseekingfreedom.com and sign up for notifications about that. Pre-order should be available relatively soon, so you get all the updates about that there. The second, of course, my own book is moving forward. I don't have anything concrete to preview for you guys yet, but I'm just trying to put it into your consciousness to be looking for that. That'll be after Faith Seeking Freedom 2. But if you haven't heard me talk about it, I've been writing my own book as well, which is sort of a synthesis of church history, theology, going through the Christian tradition of just war theory and American history. It's kind of a lot of different things, but I try to connect them all. It's sort of like looking at the American church and how it's related to war and empire over time, and talking about what a faithful Christian witness should actually look like in response to all of those things. So it's drawing from a lot of different sources and traditions, and I'm really proud of how that's shaping out. The broader conversation about faith and history and what Christians owe to these things is really what tonight's conversation is about as well. My guest has built one of the most serious independent history projects in podcasting, and his work asks a lot of the same uncomfortable questions that we ask here. And I've been very fortunate to meet and to have on this show some people who have genuinely impacted and shaped the way I think. I just had Dave Smith on last week. I've had Scott Horton on multiple times. I've had some brilliant thinkers and writers from like the Mises Institute, like Bob Murphy and others. And, those are people whose books and podcasts that I generally recommend to everyone I meet. But tonight's guest is different. If I could only ever recommend one podcast, and not just like the podcast, but one episode to anyone, just to sort of introduce them to, I think, the important sort of like underlying ethos and sort of thoughts behind what I do here, what we do at LCI. That would be to introduce them to episode 1 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem, which was produced by Daryl Cooper on his podcast, Martyr Made. Because Daryl opens with a question that I think is the most important question you can ask when evaluating history or current events or any conflict between human beings, which is, what would you do? It's a simple question, but it's a really impactful one. And it asks us to step outside of our tribe, outside of our narrative, our comfortable categories of good guys versus bad guys, and to actually inhabit the experience of another human being. And it's a lot harder than it sounds, and Daryl does as good a job as anyone I've ever seen do it. And I think at core that question in this practice is a deeply Christian thing to do. So without further ado, please welcome Daryl Cooper to the show. Daryl, how you doing, brother?
I'm good. Like I told you before the show, I've been out working in the forest all day. I'm probably a little grimy. I'm definitely sweaty, but it's nice to get a little break.
It's nice to just go out, and there's something about we were talking before the show about how we both have, kind of like city backgrounds, and, but my background before, I made this podcast and started doing more intellectual stuff too, was in just hard manual labor. And there is something about having that kind of connection to hard manual labor that, it's hard to maybe communicate that to people, but it's something that, keeps you grounded to your own humanity and physical limitations and the world around you, I think. So it's an important part of anyone's, like, if you're going to be someone who's deeply thoughtful and reading and researching a lot, finding something to do that's physical, I think is kind of a useful counterbalance to that.
Yeah, and it doesn't even have to be something that makes you sweat and be hard in that way. It can just something that requires dexterity or focus is just as good. There's a great book by a guy named Matthew Crawford. Most people have heard of his first book called Shop Class as Soulcraft. It's a good book. But he wrote a second book called The World Beyond Your Head. And it's about exactly that. It's and he really gets into the science and the neurology of it, but it's also a philosophical book. He was a philosophy PhD from the University of Chicago, who got hired out of school in his late 20s to go work in a think tank, run a think tank. He was making like 600 grand a year, in DC, whatever, doing a think tank thing. And he just sort of had this realization. He's like, this is terrible for me. This isn't good. And so he quit his job, big, high paying, high flying job, and went and became a motorcycle mechanic, which is what he liked doing in his spare time. And the book is really about how just, we're really of creatures that are very much like evolved in our limbic system and our minds and psychology, everything else, to move our bodies and work with our bodies. And if you get too detached from that, there's a lot of pathologies that come with it. So.
Oh, I agree with that so much. And even just like physical fitness, I think is something that gets maybe under talked about, even in Christian circles. I've shared this. I'm sure I've shared this on my show before, but I remember when I was a teenager and I was on like a men's retreat with my dad, and there was this one guy there who was like just like super into fitness. I mean, just like a guy he I think he competed like he didn't qualify, but he was good enough to attempt to qualify at like a Ninja Warrior thing, and the person who was speaking like called him out and was just like, asking him questions about like how much he works out and stuff like that. And then he kind of like sort of dissed him at the end and said, yeah, at the end of the day, that's just more for the worms to eat, all. And I was just like, that kind of stuck with me. And I just feel like, I don't know if our, as Christians, especially like our bodies are our temples, we should treat them as such. And I think everything we do is supposed to be an act of worship and, trying to give glory to God. So it's like if God made our bodies, then I don't know, like trying to be, again, I'm not saying everyone has to be a gym junkie or anything like that, but just, taking, there's a healthy amount of taking some pride in just physical fitness that I think is, missing from a lot of our culture today, sadly.
That is true.
Yep. Well, for our audience who may know you from the clips of you, whether from Tucker or Rogan or whatnot, but who maybe you haven't listened to your show deeply before, haven't checked out Martyr Made, how would you describe what you actually do? Like, what is the Martyr Made podcast? What's the underlying theme of your work?
It's funny because if you would have asked me that a few years ago, I probably wouldn't have been able to give any kind of an answer because I just kind of follow my own interests. As I'm reading through all the material for a given episode or series, I start finding myself wanting to like just waste time reading about some other topic. And so by the time I get to the end of that one, I'm like really excited and I jump into the next one. And it feels kind of random. But look, now that I have enough content out there to kind of look back on it, I would say that the theme is, you kind of alluded to it at the very beginning there, is to open up, like to tell stories in a way that allows people to step into the world of, people that are, very foreign, maybe not like a different country or whatever, but people who through their behavior and their actions and the outcome of their lives may look like they're from just an alien world, like a totally different planet or something. Like you can't possibly be the same species, because but to recognize that these are human beings just like you who emerged from radically different circumstances and responded to them as all humans do in the ways that seem right to them at the time, based on their own understanding and their own courage, strength, or lack thereof, all of these kind of things. And really just sort of try to humanize everybody. And now I almost take it, now that I recognize that theme, I almost take it as a kind of a challenge, Like I started out, as you said, doing the Israel-Palestine history. I did it from like the early days of Zionism up until—
Started with a really easy one, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. Just no hubris at all there. But and it only goes up to the founding of the state of Israel, 1948. It's really just the background of the whole thing. And my real goal in that was to try to understand how things, not which side is right. Like, I really try to avoid, not on, like, if I'm on Twitter or something, or if I'm doing a provoked show, like, I've got my opinions, but when I'm doing my history podcast, I don't try to like go through the whole history and tell you who's right and who's wrong. I try to explain how does this look to them and how does it look to them? Because obviously they both think they're right. And so how is that possible? Like, are these people just crazy? And like,
Right.
no, like they have like just a certain perspective that makes that makes the way they see things like seem right to them, and they act accordingly, And so I started out with that, but when it was the Jonestown series, when I really started to recognize that was sort of the theme of the show, because most people don't know much about the Jonestown cult other than don't drink the Kool-Aid, and there was a mass suicide and whatnot. But I went super deep on that movement and just the historical circumstances of the 50s, 60s, and 70s that the movement grew out of. And the strangest thing started happening about halfway through the series. And this is like, this is when I was working for the Department of Defense, and I would be overseas like 8, 9, 10 months a year by myself most of the time, like working by myself. So I had a huge amount of time to myself, and I was working on this Jim Jones podcast series. And so I would just have Jim Jones in my headphones, because we got like 1,000 hours of his sermons and their meetings and all these kind of things, just screaming at me in my ear, like all this insane stuff, like 6 hours a day. Like, I would be listening to this guy, right? I was like dreaming about Jim Jones. And I felt over time, I think I've read everything that's been written about the group, the movement, because it's one of those topics, unlike, World War II or something, where you can actually do that. And I found about halfway through that this crazy, like truly like psychotic, paranoid movement led by this pathological megalomaniac leader that ended up in a mass suicide of over 900 people in the jungles of Guyana, I started to feel like real sympathy for them and affection for them even, and that's not something I expected when I started out. And that's not sympathy or affection for their ideology or their goals or any of those things. I just, I got to a point where I could see what they thought they were trying to do. And, for what they thought they were trying to do, they were extraordinarily committed to that and willing to sacrifice and suffer for it, And a lot of it was a lot of what they did, and this is the case in all of the series that and episodes I do, is that a lot of the evil that they ended up doing is really the result of their virtues being hijacked. It's it's not like they're setting out to do evil, and in fact, like think like you can do this like even in situations where it seems just impossible. Like, I did an episode on the My Lai massacre. This is in Vietnam. For anybody who doesn't know, a group of American soldiers just massacred hundreds of Vietnamese men, women, and children, mostly women and children. And the guys who carried that out, they had only been in country a few months at that point. And I think 3 or 4 months. And, we have like their letters home from like the first month when they were there. And they were just so happy to be there, like helping these people, like we're going to liberate them, or have, they're like writing about how much like joy it brings them to like go to the villages and hand out candy to the kids and stuff, A couple months later, they're just massacring like an entire village of women and children. And in those intervening months, like, they had all seen, they'd gone on patrol and watched their best buddy that they'd gone through basic with get blown to pieces, and the rest of the group gets ambushed. Some guys get shot, but by the time they can get their bearings and like even hope to return fire, the enemy's melted away. They never get a shot at them. Like, it's all over. And they had a couple months of that. And so when you get to the point of My Lai, it wasn't just like the pressure of the situation that sort of drove them crazy. These guys wanted revenge for their friends whom they loved, which is the loving of your friends is a virtue,
Right. Yeah.
but that's sort of the path that that's the hook that the devil uses to like pull you in. And so um yeah, that's the theme, I guess. That was your question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and what's funny is that so my dad was born in a wholly Jewish family, and then his mother converted to Christianity, and he converted to Christianity when he was a child. But I was very connected to my Jewish roots being raised, and the loyalty to Israel and Jewish identity was still central to sort of the way I was raised up. And then when I sort of discovered, the truth, like when I this sounds so like woke to put it that way, but when I started to like realize that this sort of narrative about American history and Israeli history, I had been sold in my upbringing, both culturally and in public education, was at the very least very narrative driven, and left some things underreported or unreported in that telling of history. That made me very jaded, and I was for a time much more not like neatly a card carrying leftist, but I was definitely more on the left than the right, and I had this very anti-America, anti-Israel streak. And how this pertains to what you were talking about is that like your podcast is one of the things that which you'd think I could have maybe found a way to this because of my Jewish upbringing, but in a way that was a hindrance because I'd only ever been sold like a sort of propagandized, very narrative driven version of like the history of Israel and Palestine and the Jewish people. And it was like your podcast and like going through like and not being charitable isn't the right word, but like an honest, a very sober telling of the events that happened, not just in Israel and Palestine and in the lead up to the creation, but you start like all the way back in the late 1800s in the history of Zionism, and it's just like you you do come away from reading that, and you can still come on a side politically, be like, all right, well, I still think like, what this current state of Israel is doing in Gaza and the West Bank is wrong. Also, now I have a bit more empathy and understanding for like how did this happen in the first place, right? It's almost an antidote to uh cartoonish depictions of Arabs or Jews on both sides, which is kind of what we deal with a lot in the discourse on this subject. And so, that's kind of why I said if I could get people to listen to any episode of any podcast, like your entire project, whether it's the Jim Jones one or what you're doing right now with World War II and the Germans is, I mean, it when I say it's great, it's almost not great because it's horrifying. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of like you don't when you recommend your podcast to people sometimes, depending on which series you're going through, it's kind of like, well, I can't promise you it's a good time, but it's still like you know what I mean? It's a different type of good to listen to. But yeah, it's connecting these dots in a way that, yeah, as you said, like people don't just out of the blue go crazy and just even if they do things that we can objectively label as evil, well, it didn't happen in a vacuum. And there's that cliche saying, like history repeats itself. If people who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. But I feel like no one actually lives that out. It's like, well, don't repeat the history of Nazi Germany. Okay, well, how did Nazi Germany happen? Did it just like, everyone collectively hallucinate one day that we have to go and round up Jews and throw them in ghettos, or like, are there antecedents that are being left out, as the great Robert Higgs said?
Yeah, and the trick, is to be able to do that without losing your sense of horror for the outcomes that actually, that
Yeah.
transpire. And,
Yep.
like that's the real trick of it. And not everybody's really capable of doing that. And so a lot of people will, they don't like the approach I try to take in the podcast because everybody's like theoretically in favor of humanizing everybody and sort of everybody's, all that kind of stuff. Like, it all sounds good, but well, hold on though, but not when we're talking about those people. There's
Right.
always, everybody has some people that, like, that's too far. I mean, the German one that I'm doing right now is like, it's almost, at least in our cultural moment right now, it's kind of the final boss for that. When I was on with there's this Mark Twain quote. I can't remember. I think he meant it sort of satirically, but it's still like an interesting quote. And I don't remember it by heart, but it has to do with, if we pray for anybody, we should be praying for the devil, because who needs it more? Who needs to be prayed for more than the devil? Like, this guy's, and, I think he meant it kind of satirically, but when, you look at the Germans, I mean, they've been kind of made into the devil in our culture, the World War II era Germans. And if you can look at them and understand that these are people who, as you said, were normal in the 1920s and were normal after 1946, and did not just suddenly become demon possessed for 12 years from 33 to 45. Something happened, things happened. And what were those things? And how did they make people who were just like you and me respond in the way they did? And to do that, it's really hard to, in some people, it's just impossible to convince them that there's any daylight between what I'm trying to do there and justification, which is really just not my interest. I'm just not interested in that. I'm interested in trying to understand these people as people.
Yeah, no, of course. And I think that's a very important project to do. And again, I think it goes towards it, if you don't lose your sense of horror at the atrocities that happened, but it's like, to me, that's a motivating thing. Like, especially, the proof is in what's going on right now, in a sense, because the people who have cried the loudest, "Never again," in reference to the Holocaust, have spent the last, what, 3 years now cheering on something that's very much a instance of, "Oh, it happened again," but just in a different, it'd be kind of in a, yeah, in a different region to a different group of people. And it's like, how you can say it as an empty platitude, to be like, we can't let these horrible things happen again. But I guess the way I view that is like, shouldn't that motivate you to, like, really pursue and understand how do these things happen? And it's that understanding that I think is key to defusing those things before they set off. Like, especially if people listen to any podcast, even yours, on like the history of Germany and like what led up to it, you start to notice a lot of parallels, right, between pre-Nazi Germany and America. I'm not saying it's one to one, but there are some things that track and that should give you a little bit of concern. People say that, eh, no one wants to think that that kind of thing could happen here, but I would argue it, to smaller degrees, that the mindsets, right, the sort of like mental virus that takes over, like, it has started to happen here and all over.
Yeah, I mean, the first step is always dehumanizing the other, and it's, in a way, like, I'm going to give the Zionists today a little bit more credit than you are, and everybody who has followed me knows that I've not been kind to the state of Israel or the Zionist movement in the last few years since the Gaza war started. But I do think, when they say never again, I don't think it's an empty platitude to them. I think that they think that we have to do this there so that it's never again actually happens. Like, they think that, right?
Yeah.
And if you, I mean, you can take this all the way back to, like, if you read through the Gospels, like, this is sort of like the central conflict, in a way, that Jesus has with the Pharisees and the Jewish community in general, right? So you have this group of people who, I'm a Christian, you're a Christian, so we'll just, this is a Christian podcast, right? So
Yeah.
we're just going to talk as if everybody knows what I'm talking about, basically. I'm not going to like do backstory on everything. So, you have this group of people who have a task to perform in history. Their task is to, when the time is right, bear the Messiah into the world, right? Be the vessel through which God can incarnate and live among us. That's their job. And so throughout the entire like the whole Old Testament, the whole Hebrew Bible, there's a tremendous amount of focus on policing the borders of your people,
Mm.
um,
Mhm.
as far as, interbreeding, bad, cultural exchange, bad, all of these things, bad. And why is that? Because you need to stay focused. We can't have you assimilating and just sort of melting everybody else. You got to stay together because you have a job to do. And so one of the things that happens with this people, like very uniquely in a way, is if you go through like the history of Jewish history, like written Jewish history, like in their own history of their people in the Hebrew Bible, it's very different than what you're going to find in like any other people's history of themselves, right? Or just a history book in general. Because usually what happens is somebody rises up, the Assyrians rise up, and they become the most powerful, and they write a history that says, we overcame those terrible people and all of those enemies who were enemies of the gods, and we took them out and washed our weapons in the sea, and now we are the best. And then they rule for a while. And then the Babylonians come and they wipe the Assyrians out, and you don't hear from the Assyrians anymore. Now it's the Babylonian story. It's their turn to talk. And they say, why we wiped out those terrible, evil Assyrians, and now we're the best. And then the Persians come. You don't hear from the Babylonians anymore. So you're always hearing from the winners, their version of how they won. And you never hear about what it's like to fall, But because the Jews were a people who were so tightly bound to the idea of preserving their identity through time, they did preserve all the ups and downs. And you read in their own stories, like they actually have a history of their people that includes conquest, exile, massacre, defeat, just all of these terrible things that never make it into the Babylonians' history of themselves, because by the time that happens, they're not the ones telling the story anymore. And so it gave, it gave the Jews two things. Like, for one, it gave them the ability to be the people that, from a cultural and sociological standpoint, were fit to bring the Messiah into the world, because, they had, I think that history of theirs, it gave them a sense pretty unique in the ancient world, a sense of empathy for the underdog, for the loser, for the one who comes out on bottom, and that kind of thing. And so you had to have that almost as a prerequisite for Jesus to be raised in that cultural milieu, to have like the seeds of what he was going to become, like cultural seeds there. But then the other thing it did is, it created this sort of countervailing force, which was, man, all of these people have been oppressing us. They've been like doing all just, whether it's the Romans or the Greeks or the, whoever. And one day when the Messiah comes and the exile ends, why, it's going to be our turn. We're going to be the ones on top, and they're going to get what they deserve. And when God showed up in the form of a guy from Galilee, and sort of told them, like, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. Like, you want me to go kick some ass for you? That's not gonna happen. But I am going to end the exile by making you brothers with all mankind. Well, if you have like this history of oppression, persecution, and it's a huge part of like your cultural identity, even, as you go through, then somebody comes along and says, hey, guess what? Like, it's all over with. Go shake hands and become brothers. And, not only that, but like take a seat as equal children of God with like all the nations. Like, that is not something most people are going to want to hear. Like when we read the story of the prodigal son, anybody who is just a normal person of like normal morality and everything, you read that and, man, it's impossible not to have a huge amount of sympathy for the older brother. You're like, yeah, totally. He should be pissed. Like, he shouldn't go to the party. He should just, like, of course. And like, that's because that is natural for a human to like to think of it in those terms, it's zero sum and just, and so like, the central conflict. I mean, if you look at like, I really think that the thing that really repulsed the Jews at the time about Jesus and his message, it was the openness to the nations. This guy who's going and talking to Samaritans, he's talking to like anybody who wants to talk to him. This was crazy to them back then, because they had a culture that was so focused on cultural homogeneity and genetic homogeneity and all that kind of stuff. And this guy coming along and saying, when they're expecting the Messiah to come lead them to victory, and say, no, I'm going to go lead you into brotherhood with your enemies, the people who are your enemies. It's very understandable to, I think, any person, again, of normal sort of morality, to understand why they would have been like, oh, hell no. Like, you're telling me we went through all this, and this, and now it's like, oh, it's all good. We're not going to, you can understand why people would have that response, And so when you get to the modern day, it's sort of a, it's like, if you think of when Jesus is speaking to the disciples about what's going to happen to him, and St. Peter says, not on my watch. Like, no, that's not going to happen to you. And he says, get behind me, Satan, right? Because what he's saying there is like, no, we'll stop him. I got my sword right here. And you saw that when the temple guard came after Jesus, Peter drew his sword. And he, when you get caught in that cycle of violence and revenge and everything, it grabs you and traps you, and everything that you think you're solving, it's not actually solved, because eventually it's going to come, when he says those who live by the sword will die by the sword, it's not, you better not live by the sword, or one day you're going to get stabbed in the stomach with a sword. It's no, you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword, and now that person has to carry it. And the cycle kind of perpetuates, and you're a part of that. And so, this is like how all of history works. I mean, when you look at modern Israel and Palestine today, one thing I'm a veteran, right? So I was in the U.S. military. I have very strong opinions on the proper conduct of military forces among civilian populations. I take it as a point of great pride that the U.S. military, while certainly not perfect, since Vietnam, since the end of that, has really, gone above and beyond like any other military force in the world or I would say our ground forces, at least, leave the Air Force aside. They're a bunch of butchers, but our ground forces really have, in Iraq and Afghanistan, did, for the most part, go out of their way to try to not treat the people that they were dealing with, like subhumans, which is very difficult to do. I mean, you're getting shot at, in a foreign country, and you're scared, and you've been brought up into a military culture where you're chanting "kill, kill, kill" as you run around the barracks with your rifle over your head, and so it's I take it as a point of pride that the American military has been pretty good about that in the recent wars, again, with obvious exceptions that are well known, plenty more I'm sure that aren't as well known. And so I have strong opinions about that. But when you look at the Israel-Palestine conflict, take one step back from this IDF soldier doing this bad thing to this Palestinian child. Take one step back from it, and you just it's really hard for me. And I my criticisms and my judgments are institutional. The IDF's culture of treatment of civilians is bad because X, Y, and Z. But in terms of the individuals and the people, and not just the soldiers, but the Israeli civilians and just the sort of general political culture over there, it's dude, I'm not going to tell somebody whose niece got blown up by a suicide bomber on a city bus how they should feel about the people who did that. That is not my place. And on the other hand, on the other side, I'm certainly not going to tell somebody whose little sister got hit in a drone strike by the Israelis that you shouldn't hate the Israelis, because you got to have a little bit of humility there and understand like how you would probably be in that situation and how you would respond to being told something like that from somebody who has absolutely no frame of reference whatsoever for what you've gone through.
Right. Yep. No, I mean, you're exactly right. Like I had to exercise that kind of judgment to not go into that with someone who I don't know, but like I was interacting with them on X, and I was just kind of making, again, a very basic critique of morality, just saying that like, um, I think it's wrong when Palestinian children die. I think it's wrong when Israeli children die. And so, and some of these people, who are really pro the Palestinian cause, especially now I found out this guy I was talking to like lives in the region, has family living in Gaza. And so like his perspective is very much it's kind of, again, it is mirrored of the way that some people who are Jewish or who have family who live in Israel, how they feel, where they're just like, no, they came in here, they hurt us, they killed our family, our friends, and like, like this cannot stand. Whatever we have to do to stop it is what we have to do, even if some of them die. That's what's going to happen. And yeah, you're right. It's like it's the mirror of what this like this person with Palestinian family, felt on the other side. And I just kind of, I had to, which can be very, very hard for us, libertarians sometimes. I had to kind of like turn the spectrometer off in my brain a little bit and be like, no, this is like on a human level. That's probably how I would feel if I was in that same situation. And, I think now as Christians, we kind of pray that we can rise above that, but the ability to rise above that's not a natural human impulse. That's a very much like, supernatural, I think,
Yeah,
Christ-like,
100%.
enabled
Yeah. That's why
impulse.
in the Lord's Prayer, we don't pray, please help me to rise above that. We say, lead us not into temptation, which means like, don't make me face that.
Yeah.
Please spare me being put in the position where, I have to make that choice, or I have to actually be able to hold up under those circumstances, because I don't know if I could, and it's one of the reasons why, like, and I know we want to talk about like, maybe like not like geopolitical stuff so much. It's all I do. It seems like anymore, but, just like, it's one of the reasons that I think the American relationship to Israel is so toxic for Israel as well as us, but like for Israel itself, is that, I think of it like, like you'll see somebody like the people you were just talking about after October 7th. They're like, oh, well, yeah, it's easy for you to say, what would you do if it was your kid or whatever? And it's like, oh, yeah, I'd be exactly like you. And I would hope that you would be telling me, hey, man, come back from the edge of the cliff, like hold you back from that, and that should really be our role with them, being like, dude, we get it. After what just happened, you want blood. That's how we felt after 9/11. We went crazy and look what we did. And we regret a
Yeah.
lot of it now. And be that force that doesn't hold them back because like, well, you deserve this because you're occupying their territory and they're whatever. Like that's a different conversation. But like, just if your goal is to try to de-escalate things and encourage peace rather than make sure the right side wins or whatever according to your ideology or reading of history, but the goal being, it's so easy to, we lose sight of the fact that whenever we talk about any of these things, these are flesh and blood human beings we're talking about. And so when something happens, right, like this is how sort of degraded we've become, where there can be a drone strike and, there's collateral damage and 4 kids got killed. Most people, when they hear that, well, first of all, it doesn't even make the news because like 4 kids, it's not 400 kids or something. It probably doesn't even make the news. But if it does, it doesn't really register with people. They're like, oh, 4. Well, last week there was this one that was like 150. And so 4 is like just not going to really get a rise out of me. But it's like, dude, we as a collective, as a nation, took an action, and 4 children got blown up. Like that's the worst thing you can do, is like kill a child, murder a child, and like something we did caused this to happen. And we are so separated from that reality that we don't have what should be, and maybe in our interpersonal lives would be, like the entirely natural and appropriate response of like stepping back and being like, whoa, something we just did caused 4 kids to get killed. Like we need to maybe reevaluate, and gosh, this thing that we're doing here, this policy we're engaged in, man, it better be necessary. Like we better be able to stand before the throne of God, and when he calls us to the carpet for those 4 dead kids' blood, we better be able to explain to him why we had no choice. Like, this is why we did that, and hope it holds up, because it better be good. And, like, I'm not somebody who's like a Scott type, like anti-war, just, all the time. I was a veteran, I'm a veteran. Sometimes you got to fight. I don't have like a sort of a rose-colored glasses view of history in that sense. But man, like if you keep in view like the humanity of the people that you're talking about, it will just come naturally that you will only ever allow yourself to go to war in the most extreme circumstances, and then to treat it as just the most regrettable thing, and understanding that even in the most righteous war there is, doesn't matter what it is, the most righteous war, the devil and his demons do actually possess everybody in Canada, and you're actually fighting Canadians that are possessed by demons. Like the most righteous war, you're still going to get corrupted by that. You can't escape it. There are a lot of like, it's really useful to study like primitive cultures, because you see a lot of these things that, we in our modern society have sort of sublimated, so that we sort of do some of the same things, but we do it in like a highly symbolic, kind of abstract way, and they do it very directly. And so you have like the Maori people, for example. It's like a very obvious, like kind of easy one to illustrate. When their men would go off to war, they would come back, and everybody in the village is celebrating their victory or whatever, but they would get met at some distance from the village by the priests of the village, and they would get stopped, and they weren't allowed to come into the village. And the woman priests were there, and they start casting these incantations, and these guys have to go through this days-long ritual period that is meant to, like, it has to, like, before they can be allowed back in the village. And this is a warrior culture. This is a culture, these guys just went and defeated the enemy, but even in like a warrior culture like that, they recognize that these guys are bringing something back with them that needs to be dealt with and handled very carefully. And because you can't do something like that and not have it really corrupt you on a fundamental level. And so we have to be cognizant of that and recognize that when we take that plunge, I mean, we're taking not only the souls of other people, but our own souls in our hands.
I 100% agree with that. Like one of the things that is underlying the Christian tradition of just war theory is the idea of loving your enemy. And again, that's not a natural thing. Like, I think the way you've put it before is that like, it's hard to throw excuses at the man who loved his enemy on the way to the cross, right? And that is sort of supposed to be our guiding ethic as Christians. And, we have kind of highlighted how that's hard for people who are like the victims of sort of like war from one side or the other to kind of rise to that sort of challenge. And I think it can be also hard for those of us who are like witnessing those injustices sometimes to find ways to talk about it in a way that isn't sort of also being touched by that. And I think exactly what you're pointing out though is something that like uh theologians within that tradition of just war in Christianity have talked about, that like it's not that they taught pacifism, but they taught that like when you kill someone, that like that because that's like a you've killed an image bearer of God, and you have in some sense imbibed in something evil, and that is not like that can be justified, but it's not something to be like praised or to be like celebrated. It should be tragic. And that like part of any just war, even if it was, against again the demon possessed people of Canada. By the way, I think only like, not all Canadians are demon possessed, just some of them. Um but yeah, like even if it's like the most just war in history, yeah, like justice after the war means making some kind of recompense for the benevolence that's coming home to your country, to your people, and also the unintentional evil that you've inflicted upon the people you were doing war with, and like figuring out like kind of the inverse of what happened with like Germany at World War One. Like even if the enemy was just again like think about the most cartoonish thing, it's like it was 100% their fault, they weren't provoked, there was no antecedents that were ignored. It's like, okay, but now the war is over. You have to find a way to build a lasting peace, which means, yeah, dealing with the fallout and the evil that's touched people on both sides, and figuring out a way to move forward with that. And is it harder? Yes, but when we have actual leaders in our country who claim to be Christian or Catholic, like JD Vance, um, then it's kind of like, well, I expect to like I want to be able to see some sort of I don't know, evidence that you're trying to wrestle with that. And I don't, I'm maybe I'm not looking hard
Yeah.
enough, or I'm too uncharitable, but I'm not
No,
seeing
no,
that.
you're not too uncharitable. And I mean, and that's, yeah, we feel the exact same way about this. Like, I'm not saying there's never a reason to go to war. I just want it to be, I just wish it was treated with the gravity that it really merited,
Yeah.
understanding when we embark on something think about let's say when the Iraq war started, the shock and awe, happens, and the one of the bombs gets Saddam Hussein, gets his sons, gets his leadership. The war is over on day one. That first night of shock and awe, the war is over. There were dozens of children that were killed that night in that bombing. And that's if it was like a perfect war. Like it just went unimaginably well, over in one night, all that. Like dozens of children were killed in that first bombing run. And so it's like even something like that, even if it goes exactly the way you hope, um, it's just this is one of it's just the terror of modern war is, unfortunately, like as urban civilizations now, with like so much of just strategic infrastructure located in cities, it's just
Right.
inevitable that so much of a conflict takes place among civilians. You know, that as recently as World War One, that really, I mean, it wasn't the case. Civilians suffered in World War One in a lot of ways, and they were harmed for sure. But in general, these were armies on the battlefield fighting other armies. And by the time you get to World War II, obviously that's completely thrown out the window, and it's been out the window ever since.
Yeah, unfortunately. I do wanna we already kinda dived into some theology here, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about your faith. And, we here at the Libertarian Christian Institute are very ecumenical. We have people from just about every back. We don't have an on staff Catholic, but we've partnered with Ryan McMakin from the Mises Institute in the past. But we have Orthodox here, we have Reformed, we have Anabaptist, we have Church of Christ. So we're pretty big spread here. And as far as I can tell, I haven't been able. It's just more out of curiosity, I think, for myself and probably my listeners. I'm curious what your faith background is, and if you land in a specific tradition or not right now. I know I've seen you say you're not Catholic and that you've been exploring Orthodoxy, but beyond that, I don't know if you've landed anywhere. If
No,
you,
yeah, no, I'm Orthodox.
okay,
And, like I wasn't raised Orthodox. I was raised in one of those typical American families where it sort of just goes without saying, like, nobody goes to church. Nobody ever talks about religion. It's not a factor in people's lives, but everybody knows there's a God and that Jesus is his son. And, he came down to earth to save us from our sins, et cetera. Blah, blah, blah. Like it was just kind of in the background, and it was, your mom smacks you in the mouth if you say, the Lord's name in vain kind of thing. But it was a sort of like just a fully like a background thing, but it existed. And it was enough to plant a little bit of a seed that, thankfully by the time I got up into high school and the age where I could really start getting myself in trouble, like it did like put a bit of a leash on me and kept me out of trouble probably to a degree. But I've always been, and I don't really, maybe it's just, it may just be kind of a like coincidence. Sometimes like you happen across a book or something at a certain point in your life and it just becomes like very formative for you. So like when I was in late high school, I started reading Joseph Campbell's books. And I read like all his books. I'm so into that stuff. And I was like, then I was reading Eliade and I was reading like was a big like comparative religion, comparative mythology nerd. I wanted to major in religious studies and just study all this stuff, super into it. And, most people who go down that road, they have this phase, in or around college, sometime in their 20s, maybe, where they think they have this big enlightening realization that, actually all the world's religions are really all doing the same thing. There are
Right.
dying and resurrecting gods over here, and there's one over here, and we have ours here. And, they're all kind of like, groping toward the same light at the end of the tunnel or something. And you feel very intelligent, for coming to that, because you can now stand above it all and you can sort of look at all of the religions and all of these. Yeah, it's nice that you believe in your religion and all that, but I can kind of see it all for what it is. And in an affectionate way, though, not something like I'm against. And that's a trap. I mean, this is the trap that the devil uses to ensnare a lot of people who are like intellectually oriented. And it's just the sin of pride. I mean, that's really all it is. You get so infatuated with your own sort of ability to see the big picture that it keeps you from ever being able to commit. And so I went through that for a long time and never abandoned Christianity. But I was like one of those unbearable people who like really enjoys like saying the phrase, the Christian myth, even though I'm a Christian and I believe it, but they're all myths, it's all like you feel so smart and so cool. Like I was one of those unbearable people for a while. And, eventually, so I got to a point it's not that long ago, honestly. It's probably like 15 years ago where, some different things happened in my life, but I don't think that they were really the catalyst for anything. But one way or another, I went through about 2 years where I was like, I always thought like depression was just like, oh, you're super sad. I went through like 2 years of like each day, like I wasn't sure if I was going to be around another day. Like I was on the edge, like just really sunk down in the depths of depression for about 2 years. And, that experience, I'm so happy that I had it, because what it did is it humbled me like nothing else could have. It really, really, really stripped my illusions away about, my own limitations and capabilities, because I found out like exactly what my limitations and capabilities were. And when I came out of that, like I had a totally different perspective on a lot of things, and certainly on religion is one of them, where I just sort of realized that, look, it's entirely possible that people in other religions are doing the best they can with the tools they have, trying to find their way to something like the truth that, that we're seeking through Christianity. That's fine. I'm not one of those people who looks at other religions and says you're all worshiping demons or something like that. Like I don't go in that direction. But I did kind of realize that thinking that that I knew better than to just accept the religion that built the civilization that I was born into, and has really informed the worldview and morality of all my ancestors for thousands of years and all. It's wait, what kind of level of pride, just sinful pride, does it take to think you know better than all that? You don't. You've been thinking about this part-time since you were 17 or whatever it is, and you're going to live to be 80. Probably you can count you're going to spend a couple hundred hours maybe of your entire life, because most of the time you're not thinking about this stuff. You're thinking about what you have to do today and whatever else. A couple hundred hours maybe that you've actually spent really thinking and dedicating yourself over an entire lifetime to trying to understand these things. And the idea that you're going to get it, you're going to figure it out, that is just, it's so ridiculous, and I saw the ridiculousness of it. And so I just accepted, the faith of my ancestors and of my civilization. And then, so that was the first step. And then back in my comparative religion nerd phase, I was really into Girard for a while. But I was very much into him from is this maybe the explanation for the origin of these various mythologies and rituals, whatever, sort of an academic exercise. But then I revisited René Girard, and he really drove home for me the uniqueness of Christianity. It's there are these, sure, it's really easy to find out that there are these other mythologies where there's dying and resurrecting gods because they even come back after 3 days and all this kind of stuff. You see that stuff, and it's really easy to kind of fall into, the trap of thinking you're looking at just different languages saying the same things or something. But when, his theme that in his book, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, he talks about this holy man in the 2nd century who had 12 disciples, who was said to go around performing miracles, who died and was supposed to have come back to life. And his name was Apollonius of Tyana. And he was a pagan holy man in the 2nd century. And there's this famous story that Girard tells, where it's supposed to take place in Ephesus, where there's a plague, and nobody knows how to fix the plague. People are dying, and so they call on this holy man Apollonius to come try to minister to the people and fix the plague. And so he goes up there, and he gets to Ephesus, and he says, "All right, tell everybody in the town to gather in the town square." And so everybody gathers. And when they get there, there's this miserable beggar. He's just a homeless, he's dirty, he smells, he's sick, he's a wretched beggar. And he's there in the town square, and the whole town is kind of arrayed around him. And so Apollonius says, "Now everybody pick up all the stones you see and cast them at that man, kill that man." And at first they hesitate, I guess, to their credit, they hesitate, they look around what are we talking about? And he's like, "Look, I can leave. You guys asked me to come here, so do what I say, or we're done here." And so they start throwing the stones, and they start pelting this guy, stoning this poor miserable beggar. And as they're pelting him, now his eyes kind of flash red, and he snarls at them, and now they're just stoning him like crazy. And eventually, it's to the point where there's a whole cairn over him, he's all covered with stones. And he says, "Now go dig him out." And they go dig him out, and it's this demonic, big, hairless dog frothing at the mouth. It was this monster all along. And then the plague is healed. And Girard makes the point that like most myths are some version of that. There was somebody or something who is responsible for whatever's wrong in the community or whatever, and then that thing was identified and purged and or killed or just gotten rid of, and then everything was better. He says, what he says though is what you're reading in that story of Apollonius and that beggar is the story of the crucifixion if it had been written by the Pharisees. This is there was this guy, he came along, he was creating all this dissension in the community. People were going crazy, like it's just tearing the whole community apart. The Romans were starting to get really agitated, like wondering what was going on. And then he got crucified and everything was better. And it even says in the Bible, in the Gospels, that after Jesus was crucified, that Caiaphas and Pilate for the first time became friends. It like healed that rift between these two guys who had hated each other before, right? And so it was like, if it had been written from that side of things, then it would have been that kind of a story, like all the other myths. But because there were people, his disciples, but not just his disciples, people like Saint Stephen, first and foremost, who were not willing to go along with that story. And they stood up and said, no, he was innocent. He was innocent. He did not deserve that. And we're not going to, no matter what you say, we're not going to stop saying that. And they were willing to die for that, die for proclaiming his innocence, as that was what caused Saint Stephen, the first martyr. That's what caused them to go after him, right? Saying you killed this man and he was innocent. And if they had, and also like the disciples, like you can again put yourself in their shoes and like really understand. I mean, on one hand, it's like they saw a lot of miracles and stuff, and so they had a reason to believe. But under the circumstances, I mean, after Jesus got crucified, like they all scattered to the four winds and abandoned him because they thought this, but like then this happened, and like they didn't know what to make of it. And it took him coming back and visiting with them personally in the flesh, like for them to actually really realize what had happened. And so even they abandoned him at first and went along with the crowds. One of the things I've always found very interesting in the Gospels is when Jesus comes into Jerusalem for the final week, and he's met with these adoring crowds of people waving their palm fronds and, throwing their coats down on the ground for the donkeys riding. One of the things that you wonder is like, well, where were these people a week later? Like when he was hanging up on the cross, like how are they? And then you realize like, oh, that's the same people. Yeah. Like the people saying crucify him, that's them. And it's because that's the spirit of the devil that gets into us. And it grabs hold of us, and like, and it can even scare off a rock like Peter, so that he denies Christ 3 times. This is a guy who the night before was willing to take up the sword against a whole squad of temple guards. He was 100% willing to die for Jesus, to take up the sword and die for him. What he was called on to do was to die with him. If necessary, and that's really what a martyr is. That's why a martyr is, it's so different in Christianity than it is in other religions, like you watch, you listen to like anything that comes out of the Middle East, and it's like any dude with an AK who gets blown up by an Israeli tank is a martyr, like anybody's a martyr. And it's why you can have, like in Islam, this concept that is so foreign to Christianity that, which is that you can avenge a martyr. It's like, you're completely missing the whole idea of what a martyr is if you're talking about vengeance, like you're not dying for Jesus. I think a lot of people, they have this this sort of fantasy idea of like, people probably even put themselves in like this situation in their minds once or twice. Like, it's somebody puts a gun to your head, you're in a hostage situation or whatever, gun to your head, says, blaspheme the name of Jesus Christ right now or I'll shoot you. And you just refuse to do it, not going to do it, boom. And that's a martyr. And that is a martyr. Like, give that person credit. That is a martyr. But what it really is not that's not how that kind of thing is normally going to come to people. It's going to come to people in the form of, you have the opportunity to pick up one of those stones and be a part of the crowd, or not to do that, but to do the Peter thing and just sort of slip out the back door and hope nobody sees you. Or you can go stand in front of that beggar and say, no, like, you're going to have to throw those stones at me first before they get to him, fully understanding that might mean, okay, fine, then you can both get it. Like, that's really what a martyr is, in Christianity. And so, and it's not a mistake that if you read through the history of the early church, I'm sure you're familiar with this right now, just from writing your book and just your study in general. But, it wasn't preachers per se who like spread Christianity in those early days, like throughout like the whole realm of its spread. Like, it was the example of martyrs. It was martyrs that really converted whole towns. People watched these people being led up to slaughter and doing it serenely, praying for their persecutors as they did it. Like, that's what really, really like drove the conversion to the empire. And it wasn't like a theology. It wasn't like preachers going out there and proving the philosophical concept or whatever. It was people just witnessing that. These people are praying for the people who are persecuting him, taking that example of Christ, something that really is like superhuman. And I think that, like, these people are called saints for a reason, obviously. And I've even had the thought, I don't know if this is true, but I've had the thought that, like, sort of how the apostles were given a dispensation to be able to heal and so forth, like, in the aftermath of the resurrection, as they went and spread the word, that there was almost like this period, like the period of the early martyrs and church fathers, of like superhuman Christians who were like really blessed and like inspired in a way that is not something that's just normally available. You know what I mean? Like, it's because it's so incredible. And I think you asked me something about like my faith background or whatever. So there's all that.
No, I mean, it's you did cover that. You kind of explained your how you went through that, I think, in sufficient detail. But this all, I get it. You talk about one thing, it relates to another thing. And there's so much about the early church, and I don't want to like, spoil it for those who want to read it themselves, or I touch on a little bit in my book. But like, even some of the stories, because sometimes you'll see a story from the early church and it'll have the disclaimer of like, it might be apocryphal, it might not be, you don't know. But even if it's apocryphal, it's like, okay, well, it's probably still insightful to like, okay, maybe there wasn't. It's like, one of my favorite stories is about the woman named Thecla, and like, she had this like radical allegiance, like she was, when she was saved, that like she was like an arranged marriage, and it was not supposed to be, from what I remember of the story, like, it wasn't like she was going to be put into a bad situation. I think it was like a rich man, and she could have lived in like relative, like luxury and happiness, had an easy life. But she was just like, nope, like, my allegiance to Christ has convicted me to denounce, like, I don't feel called to marriage. I feel called to celibacy and to devote my entire life to Christ. And she's supposed to be put to death for this, but like evades death like 3 times until she finally does die, but like still, dies in like total allegiance to Christ. And like, we don't see people living like Christianity today. That's not the way that we see people kind of live out their faith. Like, the idea of allegiance is something that is sort of been lost, and at least especially in Western Christianity, I think, especially in America, where we have done so much of this mix it. Even though we talk about like the separation of church and state as a Western thing, it's like, well, maybe in a political legal sense, that's how the tradition developed. But there's also this sort of like mixture of like um like viewing America as if it is something akin to like a new Israel, like a new special blessed nation that you are supposed to have allegiance to. That's like, to be a good Christian is to be a good American is almost, it's kind of the ethos I think that a lot of us were raised into, the ethos I was uh, raised in. And the idea that those things could ever come into conflict is just, it's foreign to some people, to the point where, like, if your very Christian convictions lead you to, not joining into like cheering for the bloodbath from one side or the other of any given conflict, then people will smear you as, like un-American, right? That's what they did to Ron Paul, who, I think, woke a lot of people in the broadly speaking anti-war, or, at least, non-interventionist foreign policy camp. And I'm curious for your thoughts on like how we advocate for these ideas, because it seems like there's no winning. On one hand, you have people who might criticize you or criticize Dave or Scott for, like, you guys can sometimes be, maybe a little bit too bombastic or provocative, whether it's on social media or in, clips that people might pull from different podcasts and whatnot. But then it's like, okay, they'll be like, oh, well, maybe we would, people who are criticizing you might say, well, we might listen to what he has to say if, if it was in a different package or something. And I go, uh, part of me wants to say that sounds reasonable on its face, but I also see how you all treated Ron Paul, who was like the most gentle, like, soft spoken person ever to kind of espouse a non-interventionist foreign policy, and who was also a, a devout Christian. Um, so, it's something I personally struggle with, and you talked on it a little bit, but I am curious, like, how, you know for, especially for us as Christians who see all this, like, how do we simultaneously love our enemies when it seems like we're getting smeared, and sometimes it does seem like you have to be a little like Jesus did. Sometimes maybe you have to flip tables to make a point, to get attention. But I also struggle with that, because it's like, are we, I don't know if we as humans are able to have such displays of anger
Yeah,
and do them
that's how I
well.
feel about it. Like, people bring that up, to show that like Jesus isn't against, standing up to, even violently opposing your enemies, whatever. Be like, you ain't him, and you don't have the spiritual armor that he had. Okay, like, he could do that and have no danger of it, of getting caught up in it and getting corrupted by it and all that. You're not him. Like, it doesn't mean you don't ever get. I mean, look, it's tough, right? Because, like, on one hand, my feeling, and I kind of oscillate on this sometimes, but actually, I don't even oscillate so much. This is what I think, but then I don't act in accordance with it anyway, right? Which is that, like, I actually do think that politics in general is just a trap of the devil for the most part. I mean, it's like
Mm.
it's an endeavor that, by its very nature, encourages and brings out the worst parts of us, and only people who are like, just very stable emotionally, spiritually, anything like it, can really engage in it in a serious way, without having it, corrupt them in some way. I do believe that. Um, but we live in a world where, yeah, no, I'll tell you what, I really do struggle with this, because, like, this is something I've been thinking a lot about lately, and I not necessarily settled in any one place on it yet, because I really, like, I think about like the catacombs church in Russia during the Soviet years, when the main church had been co-opted by the party and taken over and turned into a state functionary. And a lot of Christians had to go underground, and they were persecuted if they were found out. And it's like, like, in certain ways, I think that the church is almost healthiest under conditions like that. And when it comes into when it comes into power and starts playing those games, it seems like it's just a matter of time before you look around, you realize that you're playing the same games at the same level as everybody else. I mean, it's one of the things that, I have total respect for the Roman Church. I have a lot of Catholic friends. My sister's Catholic. Love Catholics. But I do think, like, if you look at the history of the institution, the thing that, when you look back at some of the more difficult periods, some of the periods that even Catholics look back at today with some regret, all of them were the result of the fact that the Catholic Church was a religious institution, but also a political institution. It had like
Right.
worldly responsibilities, and that it had to do. And once you get caught up in that game, this is one of the things that, like, in the early years of Zionism, you had a lot of religious Jews who were very much against Zionism. Some of them for prophetic reasons or whatever, but a lot of them, like, the explanation they would give is like, no. What's going to happen now is you're going to take Judaism, this thing that exists as a religion, and you're going to embody it in a state, or at least it's going to say that it's embodied in a state. And then it's going to start behaving the way that states behave. It's going to go to war. It's going to assassinate people. It's going to oppress people, all of these things, because that's what they do. And now you're eventually, this is, what some of the more perceptive ones said, is that eventually, as the conflicts that are generated from this become more and more all consuming, the political entity is going to swallow up the religion completely. And that was what they were afraid of. And to a certain extent, I think that's been borne out.
Yes.
I think a lot of people have, even religious Jews today, in my experience, it's not true of all by any means, but like that the boundary between Judaism and Zionism to them is they don't know exactly where that boundary is. Like, it's very blurry. They blend together into sort of one big thing. And that's dangerous, because again, you're subjecting your faith to, the whims of a world that operates according to different principles. And so I do feel that way in one sense. I was talking to Buck Johnson the other day. He's an Orthodox Christian too.
Right. Yeah.
We were talking about, we were just talking about Donald Trump and, like, my evolving views on him over the years. And one of the things I brought up was I get into, like, arguments with all my right-wing friends about this. Like, we were just going at each other's throats when all of the stuff was going down in Minneapolis with ICE and everything else. And obviously, like, you have one side that, like the left-wing pro-immigration side or whatever, is just, they want to turn the two people who were killed there, like, into martyrs, and they were killed by the evil demons in ICE and all this kind of stuff. My feeling with it was, it really made me, like, pull back from politics a lot, because I looked around, I was seeing people that I'd known for years, people I liked, people I respected, and who I knew were good people, who at best were, like, brushing off this woman's death, and at worst, like, posting, like, FAFO, like, she got what she had coming, kind of thing. And a lot of these guys are Christians. I know they're Christians. They're not fake. I mean, like, I know them. And I just sort of, when I saw that, it made me sort of, like, the thought I had was, I don't claim to understand all the mysteries that Christ came to impart to humanity. I don't understand all the mysteries of the faith. All I know, or one thing I do know, though, is that whatever, like, processes are going on, conflicts, or just sort of social whatever it is that ends with some mother getting shot dead on a suburban street, that you are not to be involved with that, period.
Yeah.
You're just not to be involved with it. And don't even take the other side. That is not, let them play that game. That is not a game I want you involved with. And that's how I kind of feel about that. The danger of this, I mean, like Tolstoy said, like, you can't fight a war and be a Christian. I don't agree with that. But I think the difficulty that a lot of people have with it is, Jesus would not permit Peter to take up the sword to defend him. But if Jesus was about to watch a Roman soldier decapitate a child, was he just going to watch that happen? Maybe not. He might take up the sword himself. And so there's, there are a lot of versions of that, right? Like there's this great book by Ivan Ilyin, an Orthodox Russian back in the early 20th century, first half of the 20th century, called On the Resistance to Evil by Force. And he talks about like the Bolshevik experience, where like you have like, it's like easy to say like from the safe pastures of the United States that it's easy to be a pacifist and like all these kind of things, but when you're watching priests get massacred, churches get turned into latrines and porn theaters, nuns raped, like all of these things, like to think that it's your job as a Christian to just sort of go underground and withdraw from that's a very, very difficult thing to sell to anybody, including me. I would just say though that even then, that's really the example of the demon-possessed Canadians right there at the Bolsheviks, right? This is
right.
Or the Spanish Civil War or something, where it's like next level sadistic anti-Christian evil, anti-Christian violence. You're confronted with that. Just know that maybe you have to go fight that, but do not expect to come out of this with clean hands or a clean conscience. And the adjustments you're going to have to make in your own mind and spirit in order to come out of that with a clean conscience, that will destroy you. Don't make those adjustments, because you have to just bear that now, and understand that it is going to be something to bear. And that's the best I can come to on that stuff, man, because it's like,
yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I agree. It's a very uncomfortable tension, because it's like on one hand, as we were saying before, it's like in order to carry out justice against people who like are objectively doing evil, it's hard to do that in a way that doesn't seem to violate the sort of Christian pattern that we're supposed to try to emulate. And yet it also seems insufferable as a Christian to sit by and just watch it's one thing to kind of say, I have to die.
Yeah.
Right. The other thing to sit there and be like, I have to just stand in the background and watch this evil get perpetuated to innocent people and profane, the things of our religion. And that, so there can be an unholy tension, because we live in a, not yet perfected world. There is something in what you're saying, which it was something I wanted to ask you about. It's a very complicated subject, which we probably won't fully unpack with the time we have left, but I just really get some of your thoughts on it. Like, I think I've heard you say at one point that like you were a libertarian and now not so much. Obviously you still swim in some libertarian circles, with like Scott and Dave and whatnot. Obviously here, like we're Christian libertarians, so it's like we're libertarians, but like it's not, there's times if I'm talking to, and I've done this before, I've talked to like diehard, anarchists and libertarians who like, they suspect that underneath the rhetoric, where like I'm agreeing with them on kind of like just general like libertarianism 101 points. And they're like, yeah, it sounds good. But like that Christian thing, I feel like if I just keep pulling at that thread, there's going to come a point where you're going to say, actually, right here is where I'm not a libertarian, right? Or you think libertarian, and I usually tell them, well, you don't have to pull that thread too much. I'll come out and say right away that like I think libertarianism is the most consistent expression of Christian political thought, but it's not a perfect philosophy, and I'm a Christian first, and there are things about libertarianism where I think it's dead on, And there's things about libertarianism, both the philosophy, but also just the movement and the ethos, which I think can be even not just wrong, but potentially catastrophically wrong. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, just in a very generic sense. But I'm kind of curious to get your perspective on, your thoughts on libertarianism, broadly speaking, from the Christian perspective and your own personal perspective. Because there are points, like even in just what you said about sort of saying, as a Christian, there's almost no way we can do politics, right? Because it's just such a, we're creating this mixture that we're not supposed to be in. And, you mentioned Tolstoy. I mean, that's almost like the exact Christian anarchist impulse right there. Yet I do get there's a struggle with it. So it's like I think it's at least fair to say there's parts about libertarianism or anarchism, whatever, that you find to be, at least points of it where you can find some agreement. But I'm curious to hear you say,
Oh
like,
yeah, of
where
course.
you agree with it and where you disagree.
Yeah, like when I had my phase, I mean, I read all the stuff. I've read Mises, I love Rothbard to this day. I've read all the stuff, and you can't read all that stuff and not come away with a permanent understanding that a lot of it's right. Like it's just clearly right. And this isn't really like I guess like a spiritually driven move that I made, but over time, and whenever I say this, I always hear the same thing from libertarian friends, which is not all libertarians think that way. It's like, yeah, I get it, okay, but like, let's just leave that on the table and understand that I get that. But that what I see too often among libertarians, right, is an unwillingness to think beyond like first order effects. And so, in other words, like the goal of a libertarian is to maximize liberty. That's the goal of a libertarian. The way that is best accomplished is not always limiting state power in every single instance, right? So in other words, like people look and say, just that the state is a coercive instrument, and if it takes an action, that's an act of implied violence. And, everybody who listens to your show and watches the show probably knows the whole spiel. It is, for sure, it is implied violence. Sometimes not so implied, sometimes very direct. But for liberty to flourish, you require order and stability. Like nobody is like, there's this Arab saying, probably versions of it in a lot of cultures, that 1,000 years of tyranny is better than one day of anarchy. They just mean chaos. They don't mean like, philosophical anarchy. And the point that they're making, maybe those numbers are off, like maybe their math is off, maybe not 1,000 years to one day. But like the idea is like, there's a reason that people who live under extremely like post-revolution, post-French Revolution, post-Russian Revolution, right, that when the hardcore, like kind of conservative dictator in their, in their context came along, they all welcomed him. There's a reason people welcomed Caesar when he came. Like, he wasn't like, yeah, the senators didn't like him and they killed him, but he was a hero of the people because they'd had civil war for like the last 120 years. And people are like, whatever makes this stop so that I can actually like start a business because I know that the city's not going to get burned down next year or just whatever, like people will go along with that. And so sometimes there are times when the government taking an action that, like all government actions, impacts liberty in the first instance, leads to a greater liberty, like on the back end. And I think there's a lot of examples of that. But like that's really what sort of made me step back and just sort of there's like a reflexive, just the job of a libertarian is to oppose government action at all times. And it's like, well, and there's in the implied understanding, which is not groundless, because government is by its very nature a corrupt and dangerous institution. The implied understanding is that, sure, theoretically, there are actions the government can take that will lead to greater or at least more realizable liberty like down the line. But that's another one of those traps. Like, okay, so now you've given it that power. Come back in a year and let me know how that goes. That's fair. I get that. But I do think it's just
it can be not to cut you off, but it could be a trap where it's like you've created an ideological capture where now we can't do anything.
Yeah,
because
and I mean, look,
there's always
that I'm talking to you, and I do a show with Scott, and I'm friends with Dave, and like I swim in these in these waters still. I'm still like I would probably of all of the different I'd like to live in a libertarian society. Put it this way, I'd like to live in a libertarian society, but in order to have one, you have to have a society that is stable, orderly, where people have like relationship to one another and values that allow that to perpetuate. Because one of the things about, and this you can, like, I was talking to somebody about this when it came to just specifically freedom of speech, but just like freedom in general. Like, you got to understand that, like, whatever you do, like policy wise today, that's not, if like freedom of speech or liberty is a culture. It's not a policy. It's something that you have to have like in your people, and that idea, that feeling, only flourishes in people when they feel safe, when they feel stable, when they feel that I mean, look, you are not going to have any libertarians when like any real libertarians when places where you used to like your walkable neighborhoods in your cities where you used to go to the used bookstore and the coffee shop, whatever, you can't bring your kids to anymore because there's people on the ground just rolling around on fentanyl. You're not gonna have any libertarians in that city. I mean, it's just, or not over time, you're not. And so if you have to do something that's very unlibertarian to stop that situation from developing, you're actually in the longer term like fostering like a culture of liberty, or at least allowing it to live and survive. So yeah, it's another one of those things you can kind of tell probably by how I'm kind of going back and forth on it, that like my libertarian phase never fully left me. But I do think it's there's a lot of complications there. I mean,
yeah,
especially in a society like ours where we don't have like a strong collective identity. We don't really have like a strong sense of who we are as a people, that we're engaged in some long-term collective project that is independent of what political system we have. The Russian people are the Russians, whether they're communists or Tsarist Orthodox or whatever they are today. We don't really have that as much. And you were asking about like earlier when you said like anti-American, like that whole kind of thing. Like you hear all the time that the idea of a propositional nation, America's a propositional nation. That's another kind of way of saying America's not a nation, America's a religion. Yeah. And that's why you can say you're anti-American in a way that like, that wouldn't really make sense in a lot of, like, if you're a Polish guy in Poland and somebody said you're anti-Polish or whatever, it wouldn't even really make sense. Like, you just are a Pole. So it's like, but in America, it's like this is a creed that you adhere to, to some degree. And that's what sort of makes us who we are, like the way most people think about it. And so it is like, in a way, like inherently a competing religion, that is very likely eventually to run up into conflict with your actual faith.
Yeah. No, I pretty much agree with all of that. I mean, I think that the thing I've said the most, which I think gets at the heart of what you're saying, is that, libertarianism isn't enough, because it's like you can't just get every single person to read Rothbard and suddenly that's enough to create a libertarian society. And I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence for this, but I mean, heck, like if you've spent any time in just observing libertarian circles or libertarian party circles, it's like, you'd think a group of people all devoted to the idea of private property rights and social cooperation must be a really, peaceful, swell group to hang out with. And 9 out of 10 times, not so much, because that cultural element, that shared identity is a big thing. And, something I've really struggled with, which is very germane to what you're talking about, which I think libertarians get tripped up on, is like the topic of immigration, which you kind of mentioned with the whole ICE shootings and all that. And it's like, you know, I have that libertarian impulse, which is like, well, I mean, they're not someone who's just crossing the imaginary line hasn't done anything wrong, so the government shouldn't do anything. But I also then go, all right, but also we barely do liberty here, if we do it at all. The rest of the world certainly doesn't do liberty. So, we have our own cultural problems. If we import more cultural problems, especially at like the mass rates we saw under Biden, well, that doesn't seem to be getting us closer to doing this liberty thing we want to do, right? Now, I hear you, just like you said, you get it too. Yeah, asking the government to do something comes with all sorts of risks. And I'd even say that like listen, like people like our friend Dave, I love Dave, and he was in favor of the mass deportation thing and more immigration restrictions. And I was like, I've always said I get the reasons why, but I'm squeamish about it. Because then you see what happens is that the mechanisms of doing so come with this, and even if people could say it wasn't that many people in the grand scheme of things, it's like, but there's that brutalism that then gets kind of stirred up on the right, where people are cheering the death of a of a woman, and so
Mildly of a mildly obnoxious liberal woman.
right, and so it's just like it's all these yeah, I think we're all caught in the trap, no matter what political ideology we're coming from. It's like we can't accurately predict the second, third, fourth order consequences of any policy, but it seems like libertarians can sometimes be the ones that have this hubris to be like, even though it's supposed to be rejecting central planning, they think that they have the like magic answer to centrally plan a way to a free society, which is just kind of like always oppose every government action at every turn. And I just don't think that follows. That's where I kind of diverge from a lot of more ideological, like I still call myself a libertarian, but the ideological libertarians who were just like unable to kind of see any of that nuance, that's where I separate from them.
I was talking to Art Laffer, the economist, great guy. Like he's like 90 and he's still just like, it's so crazy when you see somebody like Biden or even Trump now at their age and they're just clearly declining. This guy's like 90 and he's just like, he could still be in like the Reagan administration 30 years ago. Super smart, great guy. And I was at an event that he had put on with Hillsdale where they brought mostly journalists, but one of the people was a fan of my podcast. So they invited me to come. They wanted to sort of talk about libertarian economics, basically free market economics with journalists to kind of educate them. And so I was there and they were very gracious with like taking questions and everything. And so I was talking to Art and we were at dinner and I told him, I said, look, the thing is about like, I can agree with like, the part of the part of libertarianism that never left me at all is Austrian economics. Like, as far as I'm concerned, like they got that right.
Yeah.
And to me, it's like, it's very obviously right. That doesn't necessarily mean you adopt it whole cloth for reasons like I'm just about to explain, but it's right. Is I said, look, you're a libertarian, you want freedom, you want free markets, you want these things. In your like ideology, it is both immoral and economically unwise to tell the guy who owns a factory in the Midwest that supports 80% of the economy of the town that he can't ship his factory overseas to make greater profit, that the government has no right to do that. That's a very unlibertarian thing for a government to do, to tell that guy what he can and can't do with his private property. I was like, but if he does it and everybody in that town gets laid off and you have a gigantic spike in the breakdown of families, in suicides, in alcoholism, and all of these kind of things, you should not be surprised like 20 years later when the children of all of the people whose dads got laid off in that town all vote for Bernie Sanders. And so, yes, it's not a libertarian thing to do to tell that guy he can't do that. But if you step back and like really look at it from a broader perspective, you're taking an action or refusing to take an action that is going to lead to the opposite of what you want, like down the line. And he gave the exact right answer. He said, I'm an economist. Like, those are political questions. I'm telling you how the economics work. And, that if you violate these principles, then there are going to be inefficiencies and consequences for that, some of which you may decide through the political process are worth bearing. But I'm just telling you how the economics work. I was like, that's a good answer. I accept that. But that is the thing. Like, anytime you do that, you are going to create inefficiencies. You're going to create new coercive powers that are going to have to be guarded and policed. I mean, there's a certain extent to which, like, this is another thing that, like, made me sort of just, stop thinking about libertarianism so much, I guess. Like, is that, like, in our modern age, dude, when we've got a federal government that has a $6 trillion budget and like a $1 trillion military, and that's not even counting state and local governments or whatever. Like, the whole idea of even talking about like libertarianism it seems kind of anachronistic. You know what I mean? Like, we're living under, by orders of magnitude, the most powerful and largest state in the history of mankind.
Yeah, I get that to a point. I guess where maybe I push back a little bit is that, like, I think it's about how you sell it, right? And I think that, like, yeah, when maybe the more reasoned Cato types try to sell libertarianism in the context you're laying out, it does come across as kind of goofy, right? But, I think at its best, it was the way Ron Paul did it, which was to be like, hey guys, like, the reason all this bad stuff is happening in our economy and in our foreign policy and in our culture are because of, for reasons that libertarianism helps us to diagnose. And libertarianism can even offer us general prescriptions. Like, even that example you gave about, like, the one factory in the town, it's like, there could be, in that hypothetical, we don't know, like, economic reasons that were because of government policies, why there weren't other factories in that town, why there wasn't competition. No, but that doesn't mean, like, I think what libertarians have to do is, like, find ways like Ron Paul did. He's kind of like one of the few people in our lifetimes who did this, was kind of marry the principles to also talking about the problems in the moment, and not speaking about ideology, but without being overly ideological, right? But it's just, unfortunately, I think that most libertarians don't, well, I guess we have Ron Paul, we have Dave Smith, and heck, Dave Smith isn't even good enough for a lot of libertarians. So it's, yeah, I mean, I'm still a libertarian, but I do understand the yeah, I think a lot of things you're saying are struggles with libertarians and libertarianism that I do appreciate, because it is,
Like, one of
it's
the
a lack of humility sometimes. I think that people just, they're approaching these subjects, and they're not much different than, like, ideological, like, woke progressives, who is just like, they're not actually trying to have their own unique thoughts. They're just regurgitating the libertarian propaganda, if
Well,
you will.
it's because they discover a very stark and true moral principle that smacks them over the head, to the point that, like, I mean, look, once you, like, I went through this, when I was in my early 20s libertarian phase. Every libertarian goes through this. Once you grow up and the government's just there, it just exists, and you have to go to it to get your driver's license or whatever. It's just part of life. But then when you have that early libertarian moment where you realize that, like, oh wait, like, when we're talking about, like, should we or should we not have a new tax for this healthcare policy that I may or may not like, what we're actually talking about is, if somebody disagrees and doesn't want to pay for it and decides not to, sending guys with guns to his house to drag him out of there if necessary, with authorization to kill him if he resists, to all that kind of stuff. Like, whoa. And when they see that, they're like, well, I can't justify the government doing almost anything. Like, because, like, I can't call for a policy knowing that what it really means is anybody who doesn't like that policy and refuses to go along, I'm authorizing violence against them. That's a very compelling moral principle, and I don't blame people for getting, like, hung up on that one place, like, at all. I was for a long time. And even now, like, I mean, it's hard to get past it when you do like look that in the face, you know? But I think that, you know, the difficulty when I say that, like, we, you know, what the point I was making when I say we live under this massive state, this massive, just sort of, you know, it's so strange, right? Because like so much power is not really even exercised by the state. You know, like all of the forces that bear down upon us and like constrict our liberty in various ways. The government's one of them, but I would venture to guess for most people, it's probably not even the most significant one. You know, a lot of it's your local community, it's your family, it's like just other things. You know, there's if you know have like in the social media age, like obviously the tech companies have a lot of power to you know influence the way we behave toward one another. But that, yeah, so my point in saying, like, in pointing out like just the vastness of that was not to say that like it's already so big that like what are we even talking about. It's just to say that there are a lot of things, like you can agree that like this policy we have or this program or this whatever it is bad, but you got to deal with the consequences of the reality of what the consequences of unwinding that thing are going to be at this point, because we are way down that road. And it's like if we were back in 1882 and we were debating should we go down this road, that's a totally different conversation than 2026 being like, okay, it's been 140 years, people are totally dependent on this. People are like, I mean, like, yeah, there's just welfare or something, right? Welfare is unlibertarian. End welfare tomorrow and you will be sorry. I don't care how libertarian you are. You know, like just to deal with that in a realistic way. It doesn't mean don't end it. It just means, you know, face like do it in a rational way that like really takes account of the second and third order consequences.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, that's all.
No, I think that's
I'm
totally.
being like the critic of libertarianism here. And like I said, like I like to pick on Scott and Dave and stuff, but I'm still to a large degree a libertarian, to the extent that I have like a political ideology. I guess it's just I have a lot of sympathy for you guys.
Well, I appreciate that. I do get where you're coming from, and I think it is, you know, it's actually the libertarian analysis you just gave is similar to the Christian analysis you gave earlier, which is it's just one ingredient change. It's the instead of asking, you know, well, should I advocate for men with guns to go and do this to this person based on this law? You know, I think the Christian side of that is that, like, you know, when we're talking about policy, it's useful. I think you should always start from that position of, you know, if I'm advocating for force against someone, do I want to justify that to Jesus one day? Do I want to look him in the face? You know, now, does that mean that there aren't still real problems in the world that have really, you know, perhaps complicated answers in terms of, well, put it this way. I think libertarians are sometimes correct in saying the answer is easy, but okay, the answer is easy if you have a magic wand and you can control policy. In terms of what is actually achievable in the real world, that's very complicated. And I do think what you're advocating for in terms of being more willing to be incrementalist or gradualist in our approach is reasonable. But I do want to ask you one more question here before we close out, just to kind of make things.
Can I add one last thing to that whole conversation? Is just that I think also the final thing I'll say about it is that libertarians need to, like, when they say, for example, that state policies have done a lot of the work in undermining like the local community institutions and informal sort of relationships at the local level that that used to make people like less dependent on the state, or like they didn't have to fall back on the state as much because we had these things. Like when you say that, the libertarian response is, yeah, and that was caused by welfare, by all of these other, totally true, totally true. But you do have to understand that that damage has been done. Like we have an atomized society that is not composed of like well-organized and well-functioning communities where, where people are truly capable of like self-governance. This was like, that was like the great thing about having like real organized communities, is you didn't have to have government policies telling what to do. They managed themselves for most. They had their own self-help welfare programs. They were all members of the church, that whatever it was, but those things are all gone. And people are out there by themselves. They don't know their neighbor's name on either side. They don't have and so people are really on their own. And if they feel like they're really vulnerable, people who feel vulnerable, they demand that the government take action to help them.
Oh, 100%. You're spot on with that analysis, and this is why I think you mentioned Hoppe. Like one of Hoppe's most brilliant observations was the application of the economic concept of time preference to cultural activity and the relationship there. And yeah, like when libertarians like to talk about the Rothbard button, and I've always kind of been one of the ones who said, listen, in my heart of hearts, I want to press that Rothbard button and end the state. Practically speaking, like even if you ended the state, people aren't ready for self-governance. They'd probably recreate the state or something worse than what we have now, because they are, not only because of their beliefs and not only because of that high time preference mentality that they've been incentivized to be in because of, the Fed and inflationary culture and policy and stuff like that, but also because of they've been made dependents, and they're not going to, maybe some people would be willing to, switch into personal responsibility mode and self-reliance, but too many people have become dependent on the system that it's they'll deem it too big to fail to some extent. And that's a real problem that libertarians have to deal with. And that's the Achilles heel of libertarianism is definitely a sort of naivete when it comes to culture and human psychology, I think.
Yeah, well,
So,
the Achilles heel is democracy, and
oh,
like
yeah.
if
Yeah.
I was the emperor of America, like the 100% dictator of the country, you'd all live in a libertarian country. But short of that, it's going to be very, very, very difficult to get everybody on board in a consistent,
Well,
long-term manner for it.
it does probably, your mileage will vary, right? There's probably some states in the union in some areas that are probably much closer to this, and then ones that are really far away. So, I mean, there's probably that nuance to add in. But
Yeah.
last question I wanted to ask you. Uh, so as we kind of talked about at the beginning, the Fear and Loathing series, I was gonna boil it down this way, kind of like that step one, X, step two, was it step three profit, and step two was like the question mark. So I wanted to pose that question to you in that kind of format. It's like step one, I think of like what you're doing with Martyr Made is that like building empathy for different people groups in present time and in history, put yourself in their shoes, understand the horrors and traumas they've experienced, and then ask them what they would do. And I think maybe step three, if I could project a little bit here to what I think your maybe aspirations or hope is, that over time you can be part of what convinces people to sort of, in society, to abandon a foreign policy that is, like insane and homicidal. And it's like homicidal and suicidal at the same time, because we're killing people and we're, also killing our soul and our own nations uh in at the same time. What is, you know, step 2? Maybe there's more than 3 steps, right? But, like, beyond just getting people to listen to Martyr Made and to develop that, like, what should people then do with that? I'm always curious to try to, I think as podcasters, it's easy for us to talk a lot about these ideas, which is important, but then I always wanna find ways to give the audience something like a call to action. And so what would you leave the
Hmm.
audience with as far as something like that?
I'm going to disappoint you a little bit here, maybe, because I don't know. I don't, I'm not prideful enough to think that, I am engaged in some kind of project that's going to influence the direction of the culture or the country or anything. Like, I hope that the people who listen to Martyr Made do come away with that, a deeper feeling of the humanity of people who are strangers to them. And I do think that, that to a large degree, especially in the foreign policy front, but others, domestically as well, that by itself like solves a lot of the problems. You know what I mean? Like I see this with like the Israel Palestine thing. Like like all you have to do is convince, like in America at least, like if you're talking to a normal American, all you have to do is convince them that the Palestinians are human beings and that those are actual kids, not like, little goblins or whatever. And they have feelings just like you do. And they feel the same exact way when they watch their kid die. All you got to do is convince them of that, or everybody knows that, but they don't know it, And so you just have to bring that to the front of their mind. And then all of a sudden, the whole situation, like, it just looks different to them immediately. That's all you have to do in like a lot of situations. As far as a call to action, man, I don't know. Like, I feel like a lot of times, I feel like, like if you're in, 445 AD in the Roman Empire, and we're like two plebs on the west side, like arguing about like, what are we going to do to save the empire or something? It's like, dude, like, just go be with your family and like and build a nice life and like try to take care of the people around you. Like, these are forces that are so huge, and that in our age where we have like a government that is like democracy by name, and especially now when we have participatory media like on the internet, it gives everybody this sense that they're really participating in like the broad forces of history in a way that we're really not. Like, we're spectators of this, and to get too focused on it to the point that it draws you away from, the things that are actually close to you, and that really do matter in your actual life. That's something to be avoided. People live way too much of their lives like in places that are in contexts that are completely that are far away from them. How people can't name a single person on their city council, but they can probably tell you 30 members of Congress, in Washington from other states. And it's like, take that and just sort of apply it to everything. And that's a poisonous way of living in the world, because like you're taking your attention and just living your life in a place that is really not real and has nothing to do with you. I don't want to tell anybody to like, not go take action or something. That's great. If that's what you're called to do, go do it. But I think to a large degree, like, our job is to maintain our humanity as we go through this thing together. And like, the idea that we're going to do or say something that's going to change the direction or alter it, I'm skeptical of that.
Well, not to be contrarian, and maybe I'm just doing some good podcast spin here, but I think your non-call to action was a call to action, because I think telling people to have that empathy, but then not to be consumed by what's going on in the world, and to, draw close to their families and their communities, and to keep their humanity through it all it's probably the most important thing that we can do.
And I would even say, as a libertarian, like, the most libertarian thing you could be doing in a moment like this is recognizing that all of those family ties, community ties, just local, just all of the things that are local to where humans live their lives, that have been so eroded over the last century, and especially since like the middle of the 20th century, that make it so that libertarianism would be an incredibly hard thing to pull off, because people are just not capable of self-governance. Start focusing on rebuilding those things like within your own reach. That's like the most libertarian thing you can do, is like start trying in your most like local context to start rebuilding those things, so that we can start working our way towards becoming a people that is capable of self-governance.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I'll read these two quick super chats quick, and then we'll sign off. Michael Libertarian for $5. Thank you for that. Hey, Jacob, Daryl, don't think I'll be able to catch the whole thing live, but I hope you're both doing well. God bless the both of you. Thanks for that, Michael. And then anti-war com original, $5. Is it necessary for one to have empathy or forgiveness for Nazi Germany or apartheid Israel to understand history? Man, it's it's tough, I think, as Christians, especially, to think about that, like, when, Jesus died for the sins of the world, like when he died for the sins of every person, even that, and I think that's the point where it is necessary, right? Is to like, if we start thinking that there are some people who have just, well, they're so evil that they're beyond God's grace, I think that's a slippery slope. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and it's even if it's true, it's not our place to make that call.
Yep.
We have to understand that, like, everybody was like just born as an innocent little kid, and for some period of time, as they were growing up, they were still an innocent little kid, and life happens to different people in different ways, and we become all kinds of things. I mean, you got to think about it. Like humans can be St. Thomas Aquinas, or we can be the Aztecs. Like those are the same species. Like we have wildly varying directions that we can take in life depending on just what's going on at the time. And so I would say this, like, I don't know, she's talking from a libertarian perspective, but from a Christian perspective, which is the real governing principle for me here, is, I mean, look, like God did not come down to earth the one time that he came down to speak to us for about 3 years or so of ministry. Like this is the one time he came down, only once. He didn't come down a whole bunch of times. Like this is the time he came down, one time, to give us a message. And you can be sure that message was not, the thing that you already like just wanted to do, then like that you just naturally do that. That's right. You're correct.
Yeah.
Do that. So those people you think they're bad and you want to hate them. I came down, died on a cross to tell you, yep, do the thing that you were already going to do. No, like it's, love your enemy it is as insane as it sounds. And it implies like a total surrender of your, like, if you can't have negative emotions for your own enemies, for people who persecute you, then that's a true surrender, like a full surrender of your own will and like subordinating it to the will of God. And so it is an absolutely radical demand, one that most of us are not capable of most of the time. Even the people who, get closer than others or achieve it sometimes don't achieve it all the time. But that is what we're called on to do, even them. And whoever your even them is, even them.
Even them. That's a great note to end it on. Thank you, Daryl, for being here. Everyone, make sure you you can follow him at Martyr Made on social media. And if you just look up Martyr Made podcast, you have a Substack and stuff like that. People can easily find anything else you want to plug before we sign off.
Watch Provoked with me and Scott Horton every week.
Oh, of course. Yes, obviously. Watch
every Friday night, unless Scott's traveling, which he's been doing a lot lately. So otherwise 5 p.m. Pacific every Friday night we go live.
I just want like a small cup of just like a tiny bit of whatever makes Scott tick, because that man is just a
Dr. Pepper, dude. The guy who lives on Dr. Pepper.
That must be the secret. I'll have to switch it up.
I always thought that was a meme or something, and then I like hung out with him. It is not a meme. And you should come on with us one of these days.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do it. It'd be a lot of fun. All right. Thanks, Daryl. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and talk to you next time. Take care.